All right, I guess I'll get rolling here today. Attendance is a little light, but you know what? Maybe we'll let it go. We'll let it go today. So I know it's getting to that time of year where everybody's getting a little tired, but Thanksgiving's coming here. So my plan for today is to talk a little bit about some other aspects of growth, but maybe focus more on, I guess the personal aspects of economic growth, or accentuate a couple things I said last time. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's coming next, which is macroeconomic theory. So in some sense we had a bunch of lectures on the theory of how the world works and all that stuff, and then we paused for a minute to talk about some overarching things, and now we're going to get back into at the end of the lecture today anyway, we'll start building more theory. Just the usual administrative stuff. So I do have a new chapter up there on Top Hat for you, chapter 18. It's on unemployment, which I will talk a little bit about today, but also the chapter on growth. And then 17.5, I guess, is on entrepreneurship, and I'm going to quickly discuss, well, not quickly, but I'm going to discuss some of that today. All right, well, without further ado, last time, the big lessons, right? We saw that in some sense, you can think about the world as sort of split into two periods. You might even think three periods. So there was sort of before the agricultural revolution, then there was agriculture, and then there was the industrial revolution, right? For our purposes, what happened in this industrial revolution? Well, we went from a period of more or less a Malthusian world, right? Where every time incomes went up, population would rise, and the result was that people for thousands of years were basically at about the same level of wealth. Well, after the Industrial Revolution, that was no longer true, right? We escaped from this Malthusian trap. Population started to grow at the same time incomes per capita started to grow, right? At this clip of about, at least in the industrialized countries of the world, about 2.5 to 3% a year, right? We pulled out of this Malthusian trap. And we saw, coincident with this, increases in lifespan and human health, right? So all of these things sort of were set in motion a couple hundred years ago at this pace at which this growth rate, right, this GDP per capita of about 2.5%, maybe that's overstating it a little bit, a bit, but we wound up with this, the well-being of the typical person in the United States anyways, or other industrial countries, doubling about every 25 years, every generation. Right, so this has been a little bit unequal. We talked about this last time in terms of how some people have been made fabulously rich throughout this whole process, right? We have the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts, and now we have the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezoses of the world. There's that. It's also been fairly unequal across countries, right? That is to say, I mentioned the industrial West a couple of times, but we saw that, if you remember the video I showed you from Hans Rosling, it turns out that over the last century in particular, the rest of the world has been catching up rather quickly to us in the developing world. So there is some other aspects of this I'm just going to touch on quickly. So one graph that I stumbled across in my colleague here at the Graduate Center, Branko Milanovic, he does a lot of work on inequality, and he has this really neat diagram that's in one of his books. And it says, it's maybe my way of touching on, I'm going to move it this way a little bit, touching on some of the important aspects of growth as they often pop up in policy discussions. So this graph is really cool. It has an enormous amount of information in it. It's called the elephant graph, and it says something about how the gains to economic growth have been spread around the entire world over the past, 30, 40 years. So what you can do, and this is common when you study inequality. By the way, we have a course in economic inequality, which is very popular, and it gets into measurement and all these theoretical issues, talks about wage inequality, even a little bit on gender inequality, stuff like that. So what you can do, or what you commonly do, is think about the income distribution. And so what is that? Well, you basically take everybody in the world, take the income they make, right, and then assign them a rank based on where their income is in the overall rank of income, right? So you get the very poorest people in the world are close to the 0 percentile, right? The very richest people in the world, the people at the very top of the income distribution are way up there. So we start out by just ranking everybody. 1988, according to this graph, based on where they sit. So, based on some of the things you might, from last class, you might say that the people way down here, well, these are in the poorest countries in Africa, as we saw last time. And of course, these would be, at the top of the distribution, would be the richest people in, the United States. So you take that income distribution in 1988, and then you say, okay, well, on average, what happened to people in those percentiles over the next 30 years? And this graph kind of tells you something about, given where you started in the income distribution, how much your income grew subsequently across the entire world. And so the fascinating thing about this graph, or one of the most interesting things about this graph, to give you the good news first, is the enormous number of people that are somewhere in the middle here, right, who experienced something like a doubling of their income over that period of time, right? And so this details for us how the vast majority of people in the world, right, experienced dramatic income growth. And so this would be China, India, countries like that, right? Southeast Asia, a lot of them experienced dramatic income growth over these 40 years. But, and maybe this was implicit in some of what we said last time, a lot of the poorest people experienced little to no growth in the change in their income. So that's obviously a concern for development policy and some of those questions we posed last time, right? How do we help those poorest countries grow? And hopefully today I'll say a little bit more about that. I have a take on that it might increase the stakes for you if you're worried about other things other than growth. More on that in a second. Well, one of the interesting aspects about this is if you look here, right, you can see that it's also the case that maybe the top 15%, 75 to 95, we'll say the top 25%, excluding the very richest people, well, they also did not experience much growth over this period of time in their incomes. So who would this be? This would be the working class of the advanced countries of the world, right? So people in Western Europe and the United States, and you might often hear about this, right, in policy debates. Well, the middle class in the United States has been left behind by growth. This graph suggests maybe there's a element of truth to that idea, right? And you can even think about why, is that a lot of things that we used to do in the United States, manufacturing, for example, moved to overseas locations. And so maybe you're seeing that here. Now, how much do you, and of course then you have the very, the richest people in even the United States benefiting greatly from all of this. Now, are you going to, an economist, I'll leave it here and you can ponder this as you move along. Most economists, maybe not all, or maybe not even most, would be very heartened by the fact that everybody, almost, not everybody here, almost everyone got something from this enormous global growth in income. But you might make something of the fact that some people didn't really get much, right? But in economics, you often think about things this way. If you can make some people better off without making others worse off, that's usually a good thing. Maybe not, right, in terms of the distribution of gains from growth. So it's a really neat growth, a really neat way of thinking about growth, this diagram. And you know what, I don't really have a firm answer. Maybe I'm trying to get you, it's a teaser for taking that inequality class. I'm trying to maybe get you to think about whether or not you're worried about these sorts of things. One thing I will also mention about growth, though, that people often overlook, and you might say that as a global citizen, this is something you should worry about, right? Whether or not other parts of the world are growing. Now, to focus your attention, I've thrown a very controversial name up there, Bjorn Lomborg, right? Does anybody know the name? Okay, he's kind of a, I guess I can just say it directly. He's a little bit of a contrarian when it comes to the literature on climate change and all of that stuff. So take what I'm about to say, however you might. He's a little bit of a controversial figure there. But one thing he points out that I think is very, very useful to think about here is that this economic growth issue at a personal level and at a global level has a lot of implications. So, and these are really implications that come from being wealthy, right? Or wealthier than you were before. So when people hit a certain level of wealth, there's a whole bunch of things they start thinking about that they otherwise don't, right? Why is this the case? Well, as we've seen, when you get wealthier, you live longer, right? When you get wealthier, there's a lot of things you don't have to worry about. You don't worry about where your next meal is coming from, right? How you're going to feed your kids. I mean, maybe some of us do, right? But most of the time, these are secondary concerns. You start thinking about the quality of your life, what sorts of jobs you're going to have, is your life fulfilling, how are your children going to do, all of that stuff. You think about all of these things for yourself, your family, and even your society, right? So one example of this is you can start worrying about the environment, right? You start to worry about how clean the water is and things like that. Contrast this with the case where you think about someone who's living in a very poor country who doesn't know how they're going to get their food, cook their meal, so on and so forth, right? How are they going to make it through the next month? Are they worried about, well, let's see, there's a tree over here. If I cut it down, it won't be there tomorrow. But you know what? My immediate concern is not freezing to death or being able to cook dinner for my family, right? When you get to a certain level of wealth, you no longer think about these things. And indeed, if you care about things like the environment, the single best way to solve the problem of taking care of the environment might be for people in less developed parts of the world to become developed, right? As quickly as possible. That might be the easiest way to solve, for example, the problem of clear-cutting rainforests and things like that, right? We worry about that stuff because we have the luxury of being able to worrying about things like that. That's a food for thought, a little piece of something for you to think about when you think about these things like climate change and stuff like that. One of the things I might add on to this is that if you think that this is a reasonable objective, right, and that a lot of secondary objectives will fall into place, right, once people get to a certain level of income, the question then becomes, well, how do you get this to happen as quickly as possible? The best answer we have right now, and it's not really even that close, is free market activity, right? The single best way to get people to grow is to allow markets to flourish and people to participate in them. There might be a better way, but we don't know what it is right now, right? So that's one last thing on, I guess, some of the social consequences of economic growth. So I thought maybe what we would do is we would just think about this a little bit more, this entrepreneurship thing. This is something I've puzzled about since I was an undergraduate, and in fact, I had no intention of ever, becoming an economics professor and majoring in economics and all that stuff until I stumbled into this class that I took. It was called Entrepreneurship and Social Change. I've been thinking about trying to get something like that going at Hunter. But it was this deep dive into how people thought about entrepreneurship, and the one thing you quickly realize is that it's very hard to figure out where entrepreneurs come from and why they're, the role that they play in society. And so in some sense it's this weird sort of social thing that we've decided to do, I guess in the Western, Western economies, starting in the Industrial Revolution. And it's a little bit like a biological decision almost. So I think about it this way sometimes, and I heard someone say this and I couldn't find the source. So in every aspect of Western society, right, conflict is more or less unacceptable, right? We've kind of set up our society this way so that we have laws that prohibit you from bodily harming, say, someone else. Now, what is interesting is that in the world of market competition, right, you're really permitted to do almost anything you can. I mean, of course, short of harming other people. But in the process, you actually do harm a lot of other people often, right? You go into a market and you can engage in competition and put people out of business, and that impacts their livelihood. So we do have, put another way, pretty cutthroat competition. That's actually, I think, a pretty good word, in the marketplace. Right? We deem it acceptable, right, if you can say build an invention that everybody, all the consumers out there want, but at the same time you wind up knocking everybody else out of business, right? If you're more efficient, if you're more productive, if you're more desirable. It's a pretty interesting thing that we've kind of done more or less unwittingly. And so we actually have an interesting economist who I think has a really neat way of, and I can show you how this works, of thinking about all of this and its process, the role that this entrepreneurship plays in economic growth. And he outlined this theory called creative destruction, right? And so Joseph Schumpeter is the name. He's an economist at Harvard for many years, originally from Austria. He was a pretty colorful character. I think, let's see what I have here for the link. There he is. And you can take a look at that if you like. One famous quote of his is, he said, when I set out to make my name in the world, I had 3 goals. To be the greatest horseman in Austria, to be the biggest lover in Vienna, and to be the best economist in the world. I have reached 2 of those 3 goals. Not sure which 2, right? That's kind of the funny thing about the statement, is what he said here. So he has this theory of creative destruction. I can actually show you how it works in terms of a diagram. And believe it or not, by using some of our game theory tools and our supply and demand tools, we can have kind of a neat look at what it is and even understand why you might think about it as destruction. So it works kind of like this. You imagine your typical industry is moving along, all those nice diagrams we drew about long-run competitive equilibrium hold, right? So you have price at the minimum of average cost, consumers buying, suppliers supplying, all that stuff. And then along comes an entrepreneur with a new idea, right? What does this entrepreneur do? Blows up that nice competitive equilibrium, right? Blows it all up, knocks a whole bunch of people out of business, drives all these previously, surplus earning, I'll say, businesses out of the industry, and somehow wades through all of this conflict. There is an air of romanticism about this story, right? That this entrepreneur is, a force of personality who can handle the things that inevitably happen when you knock a whole bunch of people out of business. But then what happens over time is people catch on, the industry catches up to the entrepreneur, more people enter, and then boom, we're back in the original state again, right? Where we have that steady competitive equilibrium. Until what happens? Boom! Along comes another entrepreneur to disrupt the equilibrium. So it's kind of a neat idea. You have this entrepreneur as the person who disrupts the competitive equilibrium. But one thing you might even think about is you might add on to this when you knock out all these people out of business, you suddenly have resources available for something else. So I have a little story I'll tell you about my own experiences here. So how would this work in terms of our graph? It's kind of I have a little, in chapter 17.5, there's a little write-up of this. But you can imagine that you have a situation kind of like this, right? Where we'll draw, let's go lower here, draw supply, or here's demand. Here's some supply function, here's quantity, here's price, and of course we can look at this, say here's our equilibrium quantity, here's our consumer surplus, well that's nice, right? Here's our producer surplus, everything is great. So we might imagine this is some project. By the way, there's a number of different ways you can draw these sorts of diagrams and think about this stuff. Competitive equilibrium, Everything's great. Let's suppose our entrepreneur comes along now with a new way of producing things, and for simplicity, we might even think about this as someone who can just provide as much of this product at some constant cost. So maybe the entrepreneur comes along and has this marginal cost of production, and in some sense this is the entrepreneur's supply curve, right? Now what the entrepreneur can do is, well, in an extreme case, I'll draw a very extreme case in a second, they can pick some price along here, say, right, and earn producer surplus in here, right? So because of this constant marginal cost, consumers benefit, right? The market is now better served at a lower price. Consumer surplus expands, but you might notice that now all of that producer surplus has been destroyed in effect, right? That is to say, people in the industry were previously destroyed. And so all of this surplus is lost. You can even draw this diagram in a more extreme sense where, you might imagine that the entire industry, if we drew it like this, the entrepreneur comes along and engages, if they have costs here, they could set a price here, and that would be like a limit pricing thing as we talked about, right? So now they've basically set the price so low so that the entire industry as it once existed is gone, right? Everybody is gone. And so you can see here, though, that there are various causes in this diagram that build up here. There's the surplus that the entrepreneur earns. You can imagine that if this goes to one person, that's a lot of surplus, right? There's this shaded blue area here, the deeply shaded area I shaded in. That's lost producer surplus. That's the established industry that is now gone, right? All those people are gone. And then you can see that the consumers benefit, right, from this because the industry is increased. And that's a nice kind of way of thinking about what this is, but if you think about this rectangle here and this blue shade here, well, in some sense that's an existential struggle, right, between the entrepreneur who's trying to get into this industry and dominate it, and the established interests, who certainly aren't going to go away without a fight, right? So this is actually a big story that's played out again and again and again in U.S. history, and I think largely to the benefit for the American consumer, maybe the American society in general, as I'm about to say here. So I drew the graphs out, and this is just kind of a note to self, but I kind of did it. And if you think about some of these stories, I love, I have a list of books that I'm going to give you for, winter break reading, if you want to read more about some of the subjects in the class. And both of the books I'm going to talk about are on there. But it's interesting to think about how some of these battles have occurred here. So,
container shipping moves 95% of all manufactured goods around the world.
Take a look at this.
In 2017, more than $4 trillion worth of products were sent over the oceans. It's an industry that underpins the global economy. But it wasn't always as big or as efficient as it is today. The idea of shipping started in 3rd century BC, when merchants realized that sending products overseas was cheaper and faster than by land. Early on, goods were loaded onto ships in sacks, barrels, and wooden crates with scores of dock workers squeezing them on decks or in tight spaces below. Ships often spent more time at ports than sailing, and not much changed until 1956. That's when American truck driver Malcolm McLean stacked 58 mailboxes on a ship going from New Jersey to Houston. This idea completely revolutionized the industry. The containers not only protected the products, but when the ships docked at ports, truck beds and freight trains could take them away without repackaging. A flurry of innovation followed, and container sizes were standardized. In 1966, Moore McCormick Line started the first transatlantic container service. And then in 1968, one of the first modern container ships hit the water. The Japanese component line carried 752 20-foot containers using the standards still used today. Cargo can now be moved from purpose-built vessels to rail and roads in massive volumes, cutting transport costs by at least 75%. This led to the emergence of global shipping behemoths like Denmark's Maersk Line, France's CMA CGM, and China's COSCO. By the 1980s, around 90% of manufactured goods were containerized. From designer dresses, food, home goods, electronics, and heavy machinery. Globalization exploded as ships moved Asian goods to the West and vice versa.
Okay, you get the idea. There's a really neat book about this called The Box, right? And actually this writer, Mark Levinson, writes a lot of these sort of industrial history books. I read them all, and it's fascinating. So one thing you get when you read this book, though, is you get the fellow who started the container ship industry had all these things. He was, sort of, they say a truck driver. He was knee deep in this transport industry and was very frustrated by all of the various constituents he had to deal with. He was frustrated by dock workers, by the trucking industry that he had to deal with, all the regulations and all of that stuff. So he was able to, he said, how can I get around all of this? And he came up with this, he started this system, right? One of the interesting aspects of this, too, was that there happened to be surplus things laying around. This is a part of the industry. Surplus laying around. World War II, aircraft carriers, right? Happened to be laying around, and that was another way to get the container industry up and running, right? And so if you read about this, it's really interesting because the typical, I think about this a lot, the typical entrepreneur is someone who obsesses about a problem, right? It keeps them awake at night. It could be this, it could be what do people want? I think they would really want this. And they think, and they take in all of this information and then, hopefully come up with something that we want, right? And of course, we're kind of, at least in consumer products, we're kind of like the bad, boyfriend or girlfriend, where we look at it, we're like, we don't want that, and then we just move on, right? But this person, meanwhile, has thought about these problems in great depth, how to do it. So a really cool book about this is about this business called The Great A&P, which is another really interesting book about an industry. And this is really a book about a tale about big retail, right? So the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company started actually in Lower Manhattan, and over the course of, this was in the 1870s, I believe, it gradually grew until by 1915 it was the biggest retailer in the United States, groceries, right? And then for the next 50 years, 1915 to 1975, roughly, 1970 I'll say, roughly, it was the biggest retailer in the United States and in the world. It sold groceries and all kinds of innovations, right? It had labeled packaging, branded packaging, so it's really interesting the way they found all these innovations more or less by accident. So boxed packaging, where you'd take stuff like cereal or wheat or whatever and put it in a box and sell it on a shelf, that was all A&P's doing, right? And they figured this out by accident because they had this bag cutting machine, and someone screwed up the settings, and it wound up just scoring these heavy bags that they were putting in there rather than cutting them. And they were like, we can use this to fold things into boxes, put stuff in there. And we'll put the stuff on the shelf and allow consumers to pick out their own goods, right? Shopping cart, pay. You take it for granted now, but that wasn't the way grocers worked. Before that, it looked like, or the way it worked is you would go to the grocery store, there'd be a grocer there, everything would be behind a counter, and you would tell the grocer what you wanted, and the grocer would get it and then put it in, give it to you. So they had that, they had cellophane wrapping, right, which they figured out people liked produce they could see, but they also wanted to protect it. And their model was based, as most big retail is, on very low prices, right? Something like what I'm describing in my graph there, limit pricing, right? Low prices, and just volume, selling as much as you possibly can, right? Now, one thing that's interesting about the A&P here is that They were the biggest retailer in the world in the 60s. And how many people, by the way, have heard of A&P in the class here? Well, one person, right? Almost no one, right? They disappeared in what was, kind of a blink of an eye. Why did this happen? Well, it's very much like what I was just describing, the whims of the consumer. Other firms were doing stuff that we just decided, hey, from day to day, we like that more. A&P made their bet on one mistake they made was they didn't think people wanted to buy stuff other than food from their stores, right? So what did, they said, we don't need plastic bags, toothpaste, we don't need that stuff in our stores. Well, somebody else was there to do it. And by the time A&P figured it out and tried to recover, it was a little bit too late. There were other things like that, and so boom, creative destruction. So I think about this quite a bit because the part of the world where I grew up, for what I think is was kind of an accident of history. They were going to build a highway through the area, but then didn't for various reasons. And so when I grew up, we had a general store in my town and all that, and all the little towns around my town, everybody had their general store, and it was kind of like this. It was, it was a little bit, you buy stuff off the shelf, but there were these small general stores and all that. Then Walmart came along, and predictably, there was a lot of sort of strife about this, ban Walmart, people didn't like it, and all that stuff, yet somehow we all went there and bought everything. But predictably what happened is most of these general stores went out of business. But one of the interesting things about this is this was small town New England. One of the interesting things about this is over time, people looked at this and said, well, there's all these nice store spaces that are just sort of, in the middle of these small towns. Well, they remade themselves as little bakeries, bed and breakfasts, things like that, right? So now people go, oh, let's go look at the foliage and, we'll have a muffin and a coffee at this nice little place here, right? So that was kind of the version here of the creative destruction, I guess you could say. So it's really fascinating to me to think about these retail giants and just big retail in the history of the United States. And, there's A&P, but there's also the famous Sears Corporation, right? Which is still with us, I guess, but struggling. The Sears catalog, this developed over time, was very much like the Amazon of the day, right? So I remember as a kid, you would get the Sears catalog, it was this big fat thing, and it was hundreds of pages long. It had everything in there. If you go back far enough, you can even buy a house from Sears, right? Sears sold, I have this nice little link here, the houses in the mail. They sold a kit home, and you could have this delivered to your neighborhood, right? It would come on a train and then on a truck. They just plop it down. They would even help you with financing and all that stuff. And then they had instructions for how to put it up, and you could get your whole house there. And now, of course, we have all these big retail places, Costco, Home Depot, Amazon, even cruise lines, right? Maybe a little bit on economic progress. When I was a kid, nobody went on a cruise. Nobody I knew anyway. But you watched The Love Boat. There was a show about a cruise that was on television all the time, The Love Boat. I watched it sometimes. But now, I tell my colleagues, I was like, well, we went on a cruise, and they're like, oh, some kind of rube, Everybody goes on cruises. And indeed, this is kind of the genius, I think, or one part of the American genius, I'll say, is this idea that I can make a product, and then I'll make money by making sure or trying to make sure that everybody can get it. And I think about this a lot. So you think about like your typical phone. Everybody spends a lot of time on their phone. One of the interesting things about phones is that almost everybody has one, and the phone that they have isn't that different. Like your phone isn't that different from, say, Elon Musk's phone or Brad Pitt's phone or whatever, right? Everybody has a phone that's about the same, which is kind of an amazing thing. Now, you might think about this as being a little bit of a, okay, great baker, consumerism. But if you look at it from a slightly different angle, you might sort of think about what sort of role this has played in pushing our society forward. So you saw my little diagram there where we had the the producer surplus out of business and the entrepreneur coming along. This little article talks about, nowadays you sort of vilify the big retailers out there. But if you think about, say, the Deep South, 1930, right, Jim Crow, you're the grocer, right, you're the independent small-town grocer, or maybe you're a minority. You want to buy groceries, you have to go talk to this person. Maybe they're not going to give you the best stuff, right? Maybe, I'm not saying they would, but it could happen. It's just uncomfortable. Suddenly the Sears catalog comes along and you're like, I don't have to deal with those people anymore, right? I can buy cheap stuff that I want. Sears is happy to sell it all to me. Their model is volume. They're not into discriminating, right? They're trying to sell as much as they possibly can. Oh, I want to build a house, right? If I wanted to do that without Sears, who do I have to go find? I have to find a contractor. Is that guy, going to dislike me because of how I look? I have to find all these people. Now I don't, right? I can just get all this stuff without dealing with all the facts on the ground wherever it is I live. And so this little article kind of makes that point quite nicely. And I think about that a lot when I think about big retail and some of the role that it's played in giving, when I say everybody, selling to everybody, I mean everybody, right? And it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. And so you can take a little bit about, take a look at this, right? And so one thing that's interesting is if you read that A&P book, you see that there was these established interests, much like my surplus conflicts there on my diagram. There was the Independent Grocers Association out there, and then there was the A&P people, and there were these big battles about legislation and limiting the growth of stores. There was even like people in radio in the South vilifying A&P and all that stuff, and it did have this ugly undertone. So that's something to think about. And I sort of think about this every time I go into Costco, which is regrettably a lot. But I sort of look around and I'm like, everybody is here, Everybody from all walks of life, the richest people, the poorest people, we're all there at Costco, buying the same stuff, right? Not even really thinking about it, what's going on. But I think sort of, people walk into Costco and you think, well, I'm going to buy this. I look around and I'm like, this is kind of a miracle that this place exists. We're all here. There's a million little things that have happened to bring this particular product here at this tremendously low price. Interesting. Maybe a different way to think about these things. Okay, so if you're tired of hearing me talk about these sorts of things, I guess it's good because we're now going to change gears a little bit. And instead of thinking about these overarching, fascinating issues of growth, we'll think a little bit about a shorter-term picture, right? And we'll think about what we might usually consider to be macroeconomic theory. So what is macroeconomic theory usually thought about? Well, we talked about this green exponential line here, right, on my graph. But we also observe that there are these giant or big fluctuations around this long-run trend, right? And you might think about macroeconomics as the study of these fluctuations around the trend. And you might even think about it as this project here. Once we sort of understand how the fluctuations work, what can we do as policymakers to mitigate these fluctuations, right? And so these are the sorts of things you hear about the Federal Reserve, the Payment Protection Plan, all of these measures. That kind of falls under the general heading of macroeconomic theory. So I say here in the second bullet point, these fluctuations are important to us mere mortals. What I mean by that is, while the historical fact, right, that there's this, on average, growth of 2.5% per year, that's, maybe the most important thing in the grand sweep of history. As individuals living our lives and getting jobs and earning incomes and all that stuff, we care a lot about the fluctuations, right? You don't need to go you don't need to dig very deep to realize that this Great Depression period here, for example, was heavily traumatic for a lot of people, right? It was a very difficult time. The same is true of all these other fluctuations. So we have the crash, the internet stock bubble, we have our This is graph stops in 2009. That was our giant real estate market crash. Those were tough times, and if we can do something to mitigate them, we probably should. So, first what we have to do is build some theory that helps us explain how these things interrelate, right? And so the two things that we're going to focus on the most are real GDP growth, year to year, right? Maybe even quarter to quarter. That is to say, that's going to be some barometer of how our economy is going. And then we're also going to think about prices, right? And so we're going to be dealing with growth rates, and in fact, we're going to develop a theory as to how these two things interrelate with a little bit of a twist. One thing I want to do, though, and this is important for your homework, is I want to just address a little technical issue with growth rates. Right? You'll remember that what we do is we calculate these things as V, so that V2 minus V1 over V1 is my shorthand notation for reminding you how a growth rate works. Well, what is that? V2 is the value of something in year 2. V1 is the value it had in year 1. And you sort of calculate the change over the time, V2 minus V1, and then you divide by the initial value, V1. That's how we usually calculate a growth rate. But now we're going to have growth rates that go up and down, not just steadily increasing over time, and this creates what you might think of as a frame of reference problem, in that depending on whether we're talking about growth rates going down or up, they tend to have a different flavor to them. So what do I mean by this? If you look at this part of the slide here, right, you can see here I have an example where, I don't know, some index number goes from 100 to 150. So in year 1, it's a value of 100. Year 2, it's a value of 150. What is the growth rate? Well, 150 minus 100 is the change. That's 50. Divide by 100, and you get 50%. So you'd say this is an increase of 50%. Now, what if we went the other way? Right? We're going to see that we have to think about negative growth rates too. What if we go from 150 to 100? Well, if we apply the formula, well, let's see. Our initial value is now 150, so that's like V1 here. 100 minus 150 divided by 150, it's now a negative 33% growth rate. So going up, it's 50%. Going down, it's negative 33. Just a little bit of an incongruency there that we might want to deal with. So often what you do is instead of using V1, you just use V1 plus V2 over 2 as the denominator, right? So you use the average of the 2 points you're moving between. What does this do? Well, it gives you the same answer whether you're going up or down, right? And in that sense, it's a little bit more stable. So, for example, in my example like this, 150 minus 100, we get 125 as the average. So that comes out to a 40% growth rate. And if we contemplated growth in reverse, same two numbers, it would give us the exact same answer using that V1 plus V2 over 2. So my preference is that you calculate growth rates like this for our examples, because it's more consistent when you're thinking about going up and going down and all that stuff. And I'm not going to do it today, but in the future we'll have some examples where we talk about that. We talk about that a little bit more, and we do some calculations and all that. Okay, macro theory, growth rates. We have the two things we care about. Well, let's see. One, growth rate, inflation, general increases in prices. We think about this as being bad, right? Now, actually explaining why it's bad is more difficult than you might think, though I'm lucky enough to have, we're living now in a period where there's been some inflation, and you can see that almost everybody is annoyed or mad about it, right? So if I say inflation is bad, that probably doesn't, rub you the wrong way or anything. But if you think about it at a different level, prices are just arbitrary numbers, right? They're not real in the sense, when we say real GDP, say, the prices don't really matter. If they double, if we all agreed, for example, right now to just double the price of everything along with all of your incomes and wages, it wouldn't make any difference, right? If we just added a zero to everything. That would be a lot of, that would be well, 10% inflation across the, well, 100%, right? I don't know. But if we did that, we multiplied scaled everything up by some factor, it wouldn't change a thing, right? And that would be inflation. So why is inflation in general bad? Well, oftentimes it's usually the uncertainty that comes along with it, right? We're trying to make decisions here about, working and buying and all that stuff. Prices are bouncing around all over the place. It's just hard to deal with, right? And there's also, more complications over time. You're trying to take out a loan, all of these things, complicated. Inflation bad. Well, the other growth rate we have out there is real GDP. We like real GDP to be growing. That's good, right? That's a sign that our economy is moving along well. So what will happen is that, one thing we'll realize once we start modeling it out is inflation and GDP tend to kind of move in the same direction, GDP growth and inflation, right? So this is, I guess, kind of bad news. It suggests if we want more growth, we're going to have to tolerate more inflation. We'll see how true that is. But you might think about this as setting up our practical problem, even though we don't quite understand how all this works yet right now, to keep the economy at capacity, growing, but not over capacity, right? It's kind of like trying to get your car to go as fast as possible without it overheating, right? Or without it falling apart. That's kind of a good analogy. How fast can we get there, right, without ruining our car, ruining the vehicle we're traveling in? And so you might think about this as, all right, what we want to do is think about things working at capacity. Well, once we've sort of decided that if we can get to capacity and have reasonable growth, it turns out that a very nice way of thinking about capacity is in terms of how fully we're using our resources, right? Well, in terms of thinking about how fully we're using our resources, a great way to think about this is in terms of unemployment, right? So employment, the opposite of unemployment, typically can tell us whether or not our economy is, with relative ease, whether or not our economy is working near capacity. Simple answer, if almost everybody who can work is working, right, at a given time, then our economy is working at capacity, right? When a lot of people are unemployed, we're in this situation, well, let's see, our economy could be doing better, could be growing faster, if we had all these people who are unemployed working. Why are they unemployed, right? And I'm hopefully going to make a data-driven case for thinking about the world this way. But first, let's think a little bit about this before we think about this idea of keeping our economy growing without keeping prices growing. We'll think a little bit about how we actually get unemployment or calculate it. So it kind of works like this tree over here, right? And this, of course, is one thing that's nice about unemployment is you can calculate it more or less live, right? You can get a live calculation. So what do we mean by unemployment or employment or capacity of our economy? Well, think about it this way. In the United States, we have a whole bunch of people, something like 350 million, I guess. Right off the bat, we can say there's some people that are too young and some people that are retired. They're not working anymore, so they aren't really part of our employment calculation. And so we get our working age population. We think about these people as being the ones who could be working or not. Some people are out of this labor force or out of this working age population, not labor force. Students, people in jail, people who are sick, or people who are out of the labor market for other reasons. For example, you might be out of the labor market because you're caring for a child or stay-home parent or something. And if you sort of take these people out of the calculation, you're left with the labor force. And these are people who are basically actively looking for work, right, but do not currently have jobs, right? Right, so these are not people, right, I should say here on my slide, these are people on disability, all of that, they're non-participants. So we're thinking mainly about people who are trying to work, right, who fit the other criteria, who can be either employed or unemployed. This is estimated every month, right? There's a lot of information about jobs that comes down the pike every month. And the current population survey does this, right? So they typically do a survey where they ask you, are you employed? Are you looking for work? And then they just calculate the employment and unemployment rates from that. So if you want to think about the relative sizes of this, I have a nice chart that was made, a couple of years ago, but it illustrates the point. In this case, we start with this population of 322.3 million, and then we sort of take out, the group that is, people too young, people retired, all of that stuff. And that gets us down to the working age population, so it's about 70 million people here. Then we take all the people that aren't in the labor force, right? That was the group, the homemakers, people on disability, that sort of thing. That's there, it gets us down to the labor force. And then of this group, we can break that into the employed and the unemployed. And so really the unemployment rate that we'll think about here is just this blue bar relative to the whole size here, right? The fraction of the labor force, put another way, people actively participating in the labor force that are unemployed. And quite simply, the way you calculate the unemployment rate is the unemployed divided by the labor force. So one thing that's nice about this is you don't have to, like I say, it's just a survey. You ask people if they're working or not, and then you can sort of look at this number and determine whether or not we're near capacity. You don't have to look at the GDP growth rate, which is a little bit more complicated, right? You have to wait for the data to come in, you have to think about price changes, all of that stuff. So this is a nice, here I have 4.7%. That's more or less a typical number. Now we can be a little bit more exact about what we're really worried about here. And you might think about this as, we classify unemployment to think about types of unemployment that concern us the most as macroeconomists. So frictional unemployment is one type of unemployment. You think about this as occurring just, and you might think about this as, if we were to break this blue bar here up into different slices, frictional unemployment, these are people who are just moving between jobs, looking for your first job, as you might be one day, right, or hopefully will be one day. People who have relocated, who quit work and just want to get a new job, stuff like that. That's frictional unemployment. Just, it's friction that you experience moving between jobs for whatever reason. Structural unemployment is also going on all the time, right? Some jobs just, are no longer demanded in the economy, right? Because of some technological change, something like that. Television repairman, maybe, right? That used to be a big profession, or video store owner, right? Those are things that people used to do, but because technology has moved in a certain way, they're just no longer really jobs. So the personal computer came along, and that was, displaced a bunch of personal secretaries. If you ever watched that show Mad Men, I guess people haven't watched, it's a little bit old now, but that was sort of an interesting feature of the show, was how that worked. And of course, we don't really do that anymore. We all have our computers. We think about these things as more or less just ongoing and inevitable as part of our economy, frictional and structural. And as macroeconomists, we focus a lot on cyclical unemployment, right? This is business cycle employment. When the economy goes south, people lose their jobs because just business is bad, right? Businesses aren't selling products. If you're a builder, you don't have any demand for building new buildings, so you lay off your workers. That's cyclical unemployment, and we think about this as due to the business cycle, right? You can also, and this is really what's going to concern us, is we'd like to prohibit business cycles from causing people to be unemployed. Under the idea of we focus on what we can actually do something about. Sometimes you think about seasonal unemployment, but that you can kind of fold into, stuff that just, you can't really engage in any practical policy to stop it, right? Some jobs are just seasonal. Okay, so this leads us to this idea that capacity doesn't occur when everybody who possibly could be working is working. That's simply infeasible, right? And that's one reason, or one way of thinking about the previous slide. there is always going to be a little bit of unemployment. So what we have to do is think about what is the smallest feasible rate, right? The smallest feasible rate of employment. And you can think about defining this as when all employment is either frictional or structural, so there's no cyclical unemployment, right? And we think about that as being, quote, full employment, right? Because it's really not full employment, and it'll always be some employment. We think about this, however, as our big policy benchmark. This is our situation where our economy is working at capacity. We might even say it's working at potential or achieving its potential, right? And we define the associated concept as the natural rate of unemployment, right? And we say, okay, when we're employed at this clip, right, when this fraction of people are working, we're effectively at the potential of our economy, and we would liken that to the amount of output that we can produce when we're at this point. So I'm going to show you this in a second, that these are kind of inverses of one another, right? So that when the natural rate of unemployment is low, GDP is high, or actual GDP, or I should say the rate of unemployment is high, GDP is low, and vice versa. But we're going to think about this as a big policy target of ours. Trying to keep unemployment at its natural rate, or trying to keep people from being unemployed during business cycles. And that's kind of our big goal here, is to keep unemployment at this rate, but also not having inflation. Once again, you'll see how it works in a couple lectures, maybe not today, but the idea is we want to keep our car moving as fast as it possibly can go, our economy, but we don't want it to go so fast that it's going to come off the wheels or it's going to overheat or something. And that's a pretty good actual analogy for how this is going to work. So just to show you a couple things here, I have this diagram that I kind of like here. Up here we have unemployment rates. So maybe now you're getting used to this idea. Whenever I show you these diagrams, I have a couple of motives. One is to just maybe make a point about the data, but the other is to get you used to these historical facts, right? To thinking about what our past history has been like as a macro economy. So the big lesson from this graph is that if you look here at unemployment, you can see in 1981-82 it spiked up to almost 10%. Well, at the same time, we could see that GDP, the percentage change in output, actually cratered, right? So high unemployment, low growth, right? But then you can see what goes down here. As unemployment comes down, GDP growth goes up, and then there's this point where, wow, look, we're actually below the natural rate of unemployment, and that would be kind of like our economy being above potential. And in fact, that's how this diagram is defining things. It's saying, well, the output gap is how far above this potential GDP we are. The point that I'm trying to make here is that when unemployment is up, output is down, and vice versa. So focusing on unemployment is a pretty good, easily usable objective in terms of keeping our economy moving along at the rate we would like. And of course, you can see here, you can even get a feel for how bad the recessions were. This was 81-82, small recession here, in 91, this is the dot-com recession, and then this giant recession, which lasted for quite some time, was the prime mortgage debacle, right? The real estate meltdown. And you can kind of see what these things meant for output. So one other thing that you might look at here. Here's a slightly longer view of unemployment over time from our beloved Fred site here, right? And so here you see the actual unemployment rate in red. Here's what we think is, here it's called the non-cyclical rate of unemployment. That's the same thing as the natural rate of unemployment. You can kind of see here it's estimated, it's kind of this smooth number. It's actually come down quite a bit, what we believe the natural rate of unemployment is. So now it's like 4%. In the 80s, we thought it was closer to 6%. So, people have actually reflected on that. Why is the natural rate lower? Well, you might think about it this way. It's just easier to find a job these days with the internet and all of that. vis-a-vis the old days where you used to have to go into the classified ads and all that stuff. So once again, you get this idea about how big these spikes were in employment. You can see here this enormous spike was COVID, right? The whole COVID episode. Okay, so now what we can also do then is start getting thinking about two things at once here, maybe to get you used to this idea that we're going to think about modeling and how to put this all together in a theory, right? How do I combine these, I guess, relatively loose thoughts about inflation and unemployment into a comprehensive theory as to how they actually work together, right? And of course, for those of you who are interested in stock markets and stuff like that, we'll do some of that as well, right? We can relate this to interest rates and market performance too. First, these two things. So usually what happens is, we talk about this unemployment low. Well, what happens when we compare unemployment and inflation? My graphs don't line up exactly right, but I'm hoping to give you about a century of data here, 1900 to a little bit after 2010. And you can see here that we had this, inflation. There was some huge inflation in the 20s, right? A drop here, I guess, right after World War I, a little bit after. And then when we get to the 30s, probably don't need this pointer from this close. When we get to the 30s, you can see that there was massive deflation, right? That means that prices were falling throughout this Great Depression period. And then we've had some big spikes in inflation since, right? So here you can see World War II, unemployment is really low, inflation seems to be pretty high. And then we have this other thing, we have COVID, where we had high unemployment. But one of the things I'll direct your attention to is one big historical episode that doesn't quite seem to fit this paradigm, where I'm saying there's a trade-off, or that we usually have high inflation and low unemployment at the same time. And that would be the 1970s, where we had some serious inflation, but we also had some relatively high unemployment. So we have that anomalous situation to explain as well, right? So, well, I guess we're ending kind of suddenly here. But what we're going to do next time is we're going to start thinking about this interrelationship. And I'm actually going to take a little walk back through history and or economic history, and talk a little bit about some of the first attempts to think about how prices and economic activity interrelate. You might think about this as just, let's not think about the fluctuations immediately, but let's think about long-run behavior and what it means for prices and money, and just some of the basics as to how these things go together. And so what we're going to do is describe this thing called the quantity theory of money, which was one of the first macroeconomic theories that was put into play. And then, of course, we'll be able to build out around that. But that's about all I have for you today. Have a good weekend. Remember, there's a problem set up there for you to work on. Don't wait too long on getting started with that.